All right, everybody, for this lesson, we are going to look at how we impact the cycles. We've already looked at some of the natural things that occur that can affect these cycles, and we've talked about why those cycles are important. So what do we do that can actually impact it? Well, unfortunately, most of it is not going to be very positive. So sometimes our actions have unpredictable consequences. We try to predict what's going to happen when we make decisions about things like constructing roads and buildings, but sometimes we can't always foresee everything that's going to happen. So sometimes when we construct roads and buildings, we have soil removed, and that kills the organisms and plants. We might not think so much about, tiny little soil bacteria, but think back when we were looking at the nitrogen cycle. Remember that soil bacteria, those tiny little bacteria in the soil, are the ones that are actually going to take nitrogen out of the air and turn it into something that plants can absorb. So without soil bacteria, we don't get protein and we don't survive. Right? So even though they are small and there are many of them, they're still important. The shape of the land, when we change the shape of an area, that is going to affect the drainage of rainwater. And that will have an impact on what organisms live there and what don't. Farmlands. That means that it can't be used for crops or livestock. So that means that we have organisms that can't grow in that area. And that means that their ability to impact cycles are gone. When we build dams, and we're going to look a little bit more in the coming weeks at different forms of power generation and its impact on ecosystems, building dams is frequently done to create hydroelectric power. So what happens when we do that? Well, that changes the courses of rivers and streams, because a dam is put on a river. And if we put a dam there, that changes how much water is flowing through. So that's going to change the direction that rivers and streams are flowing. It's also going to flood the entire area above the dam. So what happens to all of the land that was at one point above water, it's now underwater? That's obviously going to impact the different organisms that can live there. And in fact, it's going to kill most of them. The majority of organisms cannot go from living on land to living in water. Now, some will move, and the larger organisms will. So something like a deer, for example, wouldn't just stand around and let the water slowly cover them. But other organisms, like plants, aren't able to make that type of move, so they'll be killed by it. This also affects us, because there could have been different groups of people who lived right along the river. They will have to move as well. All right, so it doesn't just impact the organisms around us, it impacts us too. When we manufacture and consume goods, so factories making things for us to use, to eat, to wear, right? Any factories, any kind of manufacturing area means that we are building buildings. So that means the soils and the plants have to be removed to make room for those factories. There's also going to be a lot of waste produced. So that means we're going to need more landfill. And that means that area that at one time would have had a lot of organisms living in it is now covered with garbage. Factories consume a huge amount of energy, and that energy has to come from somewhere. And that means that we have to create or produce more energy, which means we have to find ways of building more power plants. And that, again, will have an effect. The production of energy is going to create waste. Now, that will vary significantly depending on the type of power generation that you use. And again, that's something that we're going to look at in the coming weeks. Stores that are going to sell those goods that we buy, so the food, the clothes, the products that we want, are going to have to not only build stores and build storefronts or, build malls, that sort of thing, but they are also going to consume more energy, and that means more energy has to be produced. The packaging, transportation, and consumption is all going to generate waste. So all of that is going to end up being put into landfill, which means we need more landfill, right? And then finally, the disposal and recycling of the waste is going to consume even more energy. So over and over and over again, we're getting this compounding effect of manufacturing and consuming goods. Now, the next item is what are called invasive species. We've talked a bit about this already, just briefly, but the basic idea is invasive species is a plant or animal that are introduced to an area that they're not found naturally. Now, this can be deliberate, and we actually have at times used other species of organisms to try to control organisms that were growing out of control, but typically it's done accidentally. And the problem with that is an invasive species will often thrive because there are no natural enemies. There's nothing there to limit their growth. So we talked about limiting factors in the previous lessons. Those limiting factors don't exist. So there's nothing there to slow their growth. So they often will spread and grow uncontrollably. So that ends up resulting in native species decreasing. Why? Because the invasive species consumes all of the resources. Less resources for the native species, that means the native species numbers go down. That affects biodiversity. All right. Pollutants. We've already just mentioned landfill, and we also mentioned that there is pollution that could potentially be provided or produced by that manufacturing. Well, let's take a look at how that can affect things. Well, to understand this, you need to know what a watershed is. And you may have learned about this type of thing in geography. But basically, a watershed is an area of land that drains into a body of water. So, for example, we have here, we've got, some hills, some forest areas, and you can see all of the streams and little rivers are all feeding into this one lake here. Okay, so that's what's called a watershed. So this entire area, any rain or snow that falls on it, is all going to drain into one area. Now, this is our connection between terrestrial and aquatic ecosystems. We've already talked about those two before. Now, whatever happens in one, because there is this transition between the two, can affect the other. And this is a quote that is often used in environmental circles. It says, everybody is downstream from someone. All right? And the idea is that watersheds are going to feed into an area. And if you live here, that means anything that you put into the water is going to end up into this large mass of water here. But if somebody lives here, anything they put into the water is not only going into the large body of water, but it's going into our water. Right? And then that the same for up here, and the same for up here. And realistically, unless you are living on the top of a mountain, you are downstream from someone. And that means that someone can affect your water, can affect your ecosystem by what they do. Right? So, what can we do about it? How can we stop all of these effects? How can we stop our impacts on ecosystems? Well, first you have to finish going through a couple of videos for this lesson, and then you can move on to the final lesson for this week.